Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Common Sense with Dr. Ben Carson. I'm your host, Ben Carson. And, in a world that often celebrates compromise and discourages conviction, we're talking about the courage it takes to stand up for what you believe in. And I'm joined by a remarkable guest, Dr. Amy Orr-Ewing, a leading voice in Christian apologetics and a global advocate for truth, justice, and hope. Together, we'll explore what it means to defend your faith in the public square, lead with integrity, and equip the next generation to stand strong in the shifting culture. Amy does this all intelligently, graciously, and boldly. So welcome, Amy. And could you just maybe start off by telling our audience, what the heck is apologetics?
Well, hello. Thank you so much for having me on your show, and what an honour to join you as a guest today. The word apologetics within Christian theology, it comes from a Greek word, apologia, which in the ancient world meant to give a reasoned defence or a legal defence. So if you were accused of a crime, your lawyer would get up and speak on your behalf and try and speak persuasively and get the jury to agree that you were innocent. So in the New Testament, in 1 Peter 3 and verse 15, Peter tells Christians to always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks for the reason for the hope within, and do it with gentleness and respect and a clear conscience. And that word, always be prepared to give an answer, is that word apologia. So for Christians, it just means speaking about our faith in a way that is persuasive and meaningful, that connects with the questions of the culture, and that makes a good account, really, of why we're Christians today.
Did you grow up in a strong Christian setting?
Well, I've got two answers for that. Yes and no. So initially, I was born into a family where neither of my parents had faith, and my grandparents weren't people of faith. In fact, on my dad's side, my grandfather was an elite scientist. They had escaped from Soviet occupation in 1948 and arrived in Britain just in the clothes they were standing up in, and rebuilt their lives really from nothing after the war. My grandfather was such a committed atheist that he forbade the mention of the word God in the house, and a Bible was not allowed to cross the threshold. So my dad went on to become an academic as well, met my mother, and they were in different places in the world. They were in the US for a bit, in Canada, and then they moved to Sydney, Australia, where my father was teaching at the University of New South Wales. And it was there that my sister and I were born. And my parents had a really lovely life. You know, they had the great weather of Australia. My dad had an intellectually fulfilling career. They had great friends. But a question gnawed away at him, which was the question, when you get to 65 and you retire, will this, everything you thought you wanted, successful career, happy family, nice house, will that be enough? And that question really worried him. And so he started on somewhat of a spiritual search. And at some point in the course of that search, he had quite an overwhelming experience of God, where he had a vision and he met the person of Christ, and he found himself kneeling before Christ and wanting to receive the forgiveness Jesus was offering through the cross. And my dad, being my dad, said, as he was kneeling down, so this just happened at home. There was no sort of religious setting, soaring music or anything like that. It really was just, quite out of the blue. And as he was looking at Jesus, he said, give me the words. I don't know how to pray. I've never been taught how to pray. And so the words that came were, Lord, I believe, help my unbelief. So that's what he said to Jesus, and got up off the floor, a Christian. Wow. He was quite surprised when someone gave him a New Testament, or he bought it. to read those words said, I think in Matthew's gospel, by somebody else to Jesus. But that was like a radical revolution in our family's life. My parents, who had no predisposition to believe in God, my mother became a Christian about 6 months later. Suddenly, Jesus was the center of their lives, and living for him and for others, it was utterly transformative.
It must have been
And at that,
traumatic for your grandfather.
yeah, well, my grandfather, interestingly, my grandfather so he'd studied, my grandfather was German and studied in the 1920s, and actually went to the Bonhoeffer home whilst he was a university student to ask questions about the Christian faith to Dietrich Bonhoeffer and others. So he had a bit of a history there, but no, he was absolutely dismayed by this and thought, you're throwing your life away for nothing. My grandmother became a Christian on her 70th birthday.
Oh,
So
wonderful. Well, you
yeah.
have quite a journey there, I must say, in the family. But what first sparked your interest in apologetics?
So my parents came back to the UK, and my dad ended up serving actually as a church planting pastor, and we were living in different places in the UK for most of my childhood. Between 9 and 16, we lived in quite a deprived neighbourhood of Britain's second largest city, which is called Birmingham. There was a lot of need. Also, people with very different perspectives, either faith perspectives or quite strong atheists. And I guess growing up in that context, I have many American friends, and I love the US. I love your country, and I love the US church. But because the US church is so big, you can live within somewhat of a bubble. You could have pretty much everyone in your life share your core beliefs. That is not really the same for us in the UK, and certainly not in more kind of frontier places. And so from the age of really 11, 12, then going into high school, you're contending, if you're going to have a Christian faith, you haven't got it just because of the culture around you. Something has gripped you. And you're going to be having conversations with people who have very different ideas. And I realized in those conversations, I think initially at school, and then I had the opportunity to go to the University of Oxford as a student, you realize that you can't just say, well, the Bible says so, or my parents say so, or my church says so. That's not enough. It's not persuasive.
Right.
Remember, that's what apologetics is. It's about finding bridges and points of connection that other people find persuasive, not necessarily that just we find persuasive. And so that sparked my interest, because if you were interested in people, then you needed to be able to relate to different ideas. So apologetics, I think, is key, and increasingly key in the US as well, with the shifting culture there. And certainly for the rising generation, if we want young people to not just grow up in faith, but also persist in faith as adults, to really explore the big questions for themselves.
Absolutely. Now, you said you studied at Oxford, and you've spoken around the world. Um, what role did that academic journey play in shaping your calling as an apologist?
I mean, I'm so thankful for the opportunity to study at that university. I mean, in some ways, it's the hardest thing I've ever done. I did my doctorate there as well, so undergraduate and doctorate. And the method, even for undergraduate, so aged 18, you arrive there. And the methodology is the Socratic method. So you can go to lectures, all the lectures are put on, and you can go. But the primary learning moment happens through writing papers every week. We had to write 3 papers every 2 weeks. So you're sort of doing 1.5 a week, and there may be 4 or 5,000 words. And then delivering that paper one to one, often with a world expert, who sort of tears you to pieces and tells you why, your argument isn't persuasive. And so I feel like at Oxford, I really learned not just what to think, but how to think.
Mm.
And not just how to think, but then how to kind of formulate ideas and communicate ideas. And I'm unbelievably grateful for that opportunity.
Well, most of the people that we know about in apologetics are men.
That's
Um,
true.
you must have had some resistance as a young woman pursuing apologetics. Uh, how did
Mm.
you cope with that?
Yeah, thank you. Well, I would say, I mean, I initially definitely experienced resistance to, as a woman, kind of speaking in public settings, particularly in churches, where there were churches that just had never experienced a woman speaking before. And so I was often the first woman to speak at big conventions or at local churches. And I found a real mixture of sometimes, just quite rude hostility that was hard, honestly, to cope with and process emotionally. There is misogyny in this world, and sadly, that's also the case in faith communities. But I feel like the core question for me of calling was the most important one that helped push through sometimes those times of resistance or even adversity. And then I began to realize that there was also somewhat of an advantage in being a woman, because most people's expectation of a Christian is of a white man of a certain age and perspective and background. And so I didn't fit the mold. And that is a kind of superpower, because you think about things differently, you see the world differently, because, I've experienced sexism or whatever. You can empathize with different points of view in different ways. You also, you learn as a woman to communicate in slightly different ways, sometimes perhaps more collaboratively or more empathically. So
Mm.
in the end, it's become an advantage. But I definitely needed to work through quite a few years of self-doubt, and I would
Yeah.
even say imposter syndrome. So I'd often be in rooms of people, and I would have the same qualifications or better qualifications than the men in the room, or the same, or even more experience. But I would definitely have a voice inside my head saying, well, don't be too pushy here, or should you really say that, second guessing myself. And I think lots of women do have to face that.
Well,
So
you must have
yeah.
had some interesting times in Afghanistan. You were there during a time of instability there as a woman. What was that like?
Yeah, so that was before 9/11. So while I was a student at Oxford, I was studying theology and religion, doing some studies in Islam, and the Taliban had just sort of come onto the scene of the world as this really strange niche group that didn't allow women to be educated, and executed men for having the wrong beard length. And they were sort of seen as absolute weirdos, but not terribly influential in the world. But I think I was interested in their formulation of Islam, and initially from an academic point of view, and then from a Christian point of view began to pray for the country, which was obviously experiencing huge oppression. And so a little group of us, 3 of us, decided to explore going there to pray, like initially as an intercession trip, but also to try and reach out to people and find out what was going on. And we got student journalist visas to go because our friend ran the Oxford Student newspaper and wrote us a letter, a piece of paper saying that we were the Afghanistan correspondents for this newspaper. So that's how we got visas to go. But the night before we left, and we flew into Turkmenistan, a neighbouring country, and then crossed the land border. But the night before we left, I had a dream. And in that dream, I saw us giving Bibles to the Taliban in Afghanistan. And so we decided to go and get Bibles in the local language and see what happened. And it's a long story. If your listeners are interested, they can look me up and find different versions of this story. But essentially, the leading foreign correspondent for the BBC had just been in the city that we arrived in, that he left the day that we arrived. And he's called John Simpson. And he was making a huge, what became quite influential documentary about the Taliban. And because of that, the top brass were called back from the front lines and arrived in that city. And so we had the opportunity to get into the military headquarters and to interview them. And so I was not allowed to speak. Initially, they didn't want me to even come in because they don't allow women to be in their presence. But for some reason, they did actually let me. Obviously, I had my hair covered and I actually had my hair cut quite short. And so I was just taking notes. So we had hours of interviewing them about their religious system, their belief, their education system, their kind of leadership pipeline, the structure of how everything worked, who decided what. And they were super open. And then at the end of this interview, we got the Bibles out. And my now husband said, we've brought you a gift and we think this is the most precious gift one human being can give another. And our friend who was with us said, it's the Holy Bible. And there was this slightly deathly silence. And I admit that my heart was really, really beating. I mean, the guy with the Kalashnikov, the horrible gun at the door, we all sort of looked at him. He didn't start shooting. So, the religion minister who called himself the keeper of the Holy Quran, he just began to speak. He was being translated by the education minister. And this is what he said. He said, I know exactly what this book is. And I have prayed to God for years that I could have a Bible. I am going to read this book every day until I finish it. Thank you for bringing me a Bible in answer to my prayers.
Wow.
And it just struck me that sometimes we can write people off. We can think, that person is an impossible person to ever be open to another idea or an intervention by God. But actually, God is far bigger than that. And he calls us to step over our own prejudices and fears. And that was a very formative experience for me. I then went on to write a paper about the Islamic theology of the Taliban, which actually turned out to be quite useful after 9/11 happened.
And I want to ask you about lessons learned from the book of Esther. How does that story speak to us in the modern world?
That's such an interesting story just there in the Old Testament, isn't it? A story that centers the experience of a young woman. If you compare that to ancient literature of the era, it's quite exceptional to focus in on a central female heroic character. And I think that speaks about who is included in the possibility of living meaningfully and leading and stepping up with courage, by having Esther included in the scriptures in that way. It says to us there's no outsiders, there's no sort of hierarchy of talent, based on race or class or gender. I think we also see the sort of a kind of visceral and real engagement with the dysfunction, evil, and suffering of the world as well, because Esther's context is, pretty close to a survivor of human trafficking. If you think about it, she's a woman who's captured up with many other women who are put into the harem of a powerful man, and who essentially called on to service him on the basis of their looks and their beauty. And so, again, the Bible isn't squeamish about the oppressive systems of this world and the kind of horrific human suffering that people go through. But it also suggests that when we go through dark valleys, including very extremely difficult, challenging, or horrific experiences, we're not actually alone or abandoned by God. God can A, be with us, and B, equip us with a voice, not just to help ourselves, but also to stand for and speak for others, because that's what Esther really does. She's a woman whose perspective is centered, a woman who's really suffered, but she's a woman who brings liberty and freedom, not just for herself, but also for her people, and who really stands up against quite serious evil, including
Absolutely.
obviously the evil of anti-Semitism.
And maybe the special gifts and talents that God has endowed us with, regardless of your gender, equips you for a time such as this. Everybody's there for a reason. It's really a very inspiring story. How has the rise of social media and things like AI changed your approach to apologetics? And is it a good thing or is it a bad thing?
Oh, gosh. I mean, on one level, like the printing press, I think social media undeniably has changed public discourse, and not just what people think, but how people think, how they sort of digest and receive information. And on the one hand, there's a sort of incredible opportunity and something quite democratic about it. But as algorithms have, developed more latterly, I think there's this drive towards division, rage, horror, and hatred, isn't there, with how we engage with social media. So I think we need to contend for good in that space that does exist. And you sort of can't roll back time and wish for a different age, but we need to be realistic about the challenges of it. I mean, if I think about how important both long form and super short form content have become now. So if you think about the discussion of ideas, and some of the most popular YouTube channels and podcasts have people talking at length and in depth, like wrestling with ideas, and in a way that I think was not happening 10 years ago. But then there's also the challenge of much more short form, the TikTok type communication. My teenagers have banned me from being on TikTok, so I'm not allowed on there yet. I have to wait till they've left home. But that sort of shorter, punchier communication. I love the longer form. I think, to really be able to go deep into ideas and encourage people to think and explore different perspectives.
Well, going way back now to 1831, Alexis de Tocqueville came to America to study our prison system. Ended up looking at everything, wrote a 2-volume set called Democracy in America. And he concluded by talking about the church and the incredible role the church played, the inspirational role, how those sermons from the pulpits encouraged a ragtag bunch of militiamen to defeat the most powerful military force on earth, gave the people a moral basis for living. How would you say the church is doing today? What's the most urgent leadership challenge facing the church today?
Thank you for that question. I think where the church is at its best, it is in the frontiers of the world's intractable, most difficult problems and challenges. If I think about the border between South Sudan and North Sudan and think about what Christians are doing there. If I think in my own country about prison reform today and who is actually showing up day in, day out for prisoners and seeking to see lives rehabilitated, the church is absolutely on the front foot there. So where we're doing well, it's where we're taking the teachings of Jesus, not just as kind of personal piety that we individualistically tack on to, the American dream or its British equivalent, and have a slightly, very slightly different life from those around us who don't share that belief, but where the words of Jesus and the life of the Spirit have so profoundly formed us that the very love of God sort of propels us into his world to make a difference. I think the other area where we've seen a leadership crisis in the church, but I actually think what's happening is good ultimately, is where there has been great hypocrisy and moral harm perpetrated by leaders that had been covered up, including, sexual abuse and abuse of the vulnerable, that some of those great evils are being uncovered. And I think of revivals of old and how revival is an experience of the presence of the living God coming into the church, and often an experience of the holiness of God. So an awareness of who God is, his greatness and his holiness, taking hold of his people. And so some of the horrific scandals that we've seen in the leadership of organizations, Christian organizations and churches, might just be God cleaning up his church. And actually, it's the other side of the coin of revival. The press is reporting on it here in Britain, something called the Quiet Revival, where young men in particular, after years of secularism and a massive decline in religious interest, right now there's this huge hunger and people turning up to churches. The statistics suggest that in the last sort of 5 years, 2016, 4% of British men aged 16 to 21 said they went to church. In March 2025, the statistics suggest 21% of young men aged 16 to 25 said they want to go to church or go to church. So there's this huge spiritual renaissance happening, and it's really exciting.
We're seeing that in America too. But the
It's
interesting thing
wonderful.
is, it doesn't seem to be applying to the women. Why do you think that's the case?
Yeah, that's interesting, isn't it? So the studies suggest that women are leaving the church, and historically, the church has sort of depended on women to do the jobs that no one wants to do, but has kept women out of the spaces where decisions are made and the fun stuff like preaching and ministry happens. And so I think it's partly a response to that imbalance. But actually, if we look at the person of Jesus and his model, we see that he centered women's voices, he attracted female disciples, he encouraged women to lead and do beautiful and radical things. And I think if we can get that right and just follow his pattern, we'll see the same thing happening, women flocking to Jesus.
Well, what do you say to those people who say that faith and reason are incompatible?
Mm.
I once was having a public debate in Hollywood, myself and Francis Collins against Daniel Dennett
Wow.
and Richard Dawkins. And of course, they believe that anybody who believes in God is a total idiot and doesn't deal with facts. What do you say to those people who say faith and reason are incompatible?
Well, interesting. Dawkins has shifted so much in the last couple of years, now calling himself a cultural Christian,
Mhm.
actually far less derisive of the ideas. So, I mean, I think I would want to encourage a friend who was saying that to examine the presuppositions underlying the idea of reason and ask whether actually atheism can account for reason. Why? I mean, C.S. Lewis put it very well in a debate with somebody called Haldane. And he said, if we think that our brains and who we are has come about as a process of a totally random process, why should we trust the ideas in our brain? Actually, a reasonable accounting for trusting our own reason, and reason at all being warranted, is that we've been created in the
Right.
image of a God who is actually rational, rather than that we're here as a process of blind chance.
Right.
So I don't think faith and reason are in contradiction with each other. That is not to say that a lot of Christians and reason are in contradiction. Sometimes we don't do a good job of examining our own beliefs or, communicating them well. But I think when in a fair way, the evidence is examined, and, if we as Christians can speak about our faith in a coherent way, there's every reason to say that faith and reason are in step, not out of step.
Yeah, I think it takes more faith to believe that all the order in the universe came about spontaneously
I
uh,
agree.
than it does to believe that there was intelligent design.
The other thing that I find really interesting is that the New Testament word that we translate as faith comes from the Greek idea of pistis, which means to be persuaded. So biblical faith has this connotation of trust in relationship that has a basis in reality, not what secularism sort of presents as blind faith, a leap into the unknown, but actually faith as trust in the context of relationship on the basis of actually really good evidence. If you think
Absolutely.
about it, all our relationships function like that. I have trust and faith in my husband on the basis of 27 years of marriage, of evidence, right?
Right.
And biblical faith is positioned like that.
Doctor, you've engaged with skeptics in universities and public forums around the world. What are the most common misconceptions that people
Mm.
have about Christian faith?
That's such an interesting question, and because I've been in this space for more than 25 years, I would say that some of those misconceptions have really changed. So when I was first starting out, it was very much the era of postmodernism. So the misconceptions are about faith were, to have belief or Christian belief made you an intolerant bigot, and no one wanted to be an intolerant bigot. And so misconceptions around truth and relativism, and how we position truth as a possibility that can still be, kind and loving, but actually substantial. And then, you mentioned Dennett and Dawkins. Then it was really the era of the new atheists, and that's when faith was viewed not just as silly or wrong academically, but also as dangerous. Your God isn't just non-existent, he's also evil. He's a genocidal maniac who causes war and all the ills of the universe. And so trying to challenge that on an evidence basis, the existence of God, perhaps with good substantial reasons and arguments, but also to explore the moral foundations of faith. And then I would say right up into the sort of teens and early 2020s, it was much more around identity politics. So the idea that really Christianity in particular, has oppressed people, and you've had colonization and slavery and homophobia and sexism and all the sort of identity questions that this generation were wrestling with, and beginning to ask for me as an apologist, beginning to help those young people examine on what our identity is actually based. And the rage against injustice that has been there, and all the statues must fall, and all of those movements, but asking the question, well, can my unbelief in God warrant my rage about injustice done to other human beings? And actually begin to show, no, I don't think it can, but an account of the world that says you've been made in the image of God, and that's the core identity of every human. So our race, our class, our gender, our nationality, and our experiences of oppression are secondary to that core truth about us as human beings, that we've been made in his image, and every human being in life has dignity, essentially, because of that sacred origin. So I think that's where we've been. And now, right now, as we just discussed earlier, we're back in this, in a space of spiritual thirst of young people, finding in this moment a longing for the transcendent and a longing for moral structure and coherence in the universe. And that's a really interesting space to be in.
It's been fascinating watching it. I've been in the last couple of years to multiple universities. And it used to be that the conservatives and the Christians were kind of timid. Maybe a few of them would show up. Now they walk proudly around with their American flags and their crosses, and it really seems like there's something happening. Is that going on in Great Britain too?
Do you know what? I think for us, it's less connected to national identity, I would say. And there are interesting layers to that, because some of the amazing church growth that had happened in the previous 10 years was really driven by African immigration to the UK, which has been a glorious blessing for us. Amazing churches being planted, but definitely that sense of confidence in God existing and being real, but also of it being okay and reasonable and legitimate to explore this. Like, you're not a complete weirdo to explore religion and Christian faith in particular. And, that's quite exciting, I think.
Well, what do you see as the greatest cultural challenges to Christian faith today, especially for the next generation?
Yeah. I think there would probably be a couple of categories. I think there's a huge cultural challenge around the basis for justice, and you've got two competing accounts around what drives justice potentially in the West. You've got the kind of historic Judeo-Christian account that I tried to just touch on a few seconds ago, which is rooted in this idea that because human beings have been made in the image of God, everyone has dignity, and that is the starting place. And so where that dignity is offended through law breaking or moral harm or abuse, we need the rule of law, and we need structures and institutions and systems that uphold the dignity of the individual and of the person, regardless of their faith or creed or whatever. And that's one account of justice. The competing account that identity politics gives us is that the drive for justice is based in grievance. And the more grievance you have, the more intersectional injustice you experience, the more power you can exert in the culture. And actually what that leads to is rage and division. And it's a very reductive view of what it means to be human. And it doesn't lead to harmony or actually justice or freedom. And this cult of victimhood and this kind of lifting up of oppression narratives. And, I think we need to win the intellectual argument against that says, no, your humanity is not defined by intersectional injustice that you've experienced, and it's not enhanced by grievance or rage. Your voice doesn't matter more because of oppression. Your dignity and your voice are established because you are a human being, and that dignity is rooted in the image of God. And then I think the second area, so one area around identity and justice, and the second area would be around life and whether we want to be a culture of life or a culture of death. You know, in my country, a bill has just passed through the House of Commons around assisted dying, and another bill around abortion, decriminalising abortion up to birth. And so the question about what a human life is, why it matters, how we protect the dignity of people, is really important. And I wouldn't just say on those two issues either. It also needs to be around education and good healthcare and, you know, a positive moral ethic for human life.
Yeah, I think our young people have some real challenges to deal with. There's no question about that. But how can an ordinary person who's a believer find the courage to speak in a hostile environment about their belief system?
I love how James talks about sometimes we can be slow to speak and quick to listen. And I think our speaking gets so much better if we're good at listening. And so I would just encourage every Christian to spend time with people who don't share your beliefs and listen to them and ask them why. And ask the Lord or ask God to sort of open your heart to people who are different, and perhaps even challenge yourself. This is how I would put it: to not attribute the worst possible motive to their viewpoint just because they disagree with you. Try and think about, what's the motive that is driving this position that ultimately I don't agree with, and try and empathize with some of those drivers. And as you do that, I think you get better at speaking, and then our confidence can grow. But of course, the second thing would be to say that confidence doesn't need to be in ourselves. Actually, confidence shouldn't be in ourselves. Ultimately, it's in the one who made us and loves us and who's with us. So we're not going into any situation alone, and we can lean on that presence of God and his help as we seek to have conversations.
Wonderful. Now, we're very grateful that you're with us today. What one message do you want people to go away with?
Thank you. I think it would be just, a message about the love of God for every person, and not to view people as other or different or impossible and to just retreat into our shell or into our bubble. But to be Christians who cross over towards others, who reach out that hand of friendship, who build bridges, and who live persuasively as Christians, as well as speaking persuasively of the love of God.
Amen. And where can people find you and your work?
Oh, thank you. Well, I have a 501c3 called Advocate Collective, and they can check out our website and our social media channels, or just my own website, amyorrewing.com. And I have a few books. I have a book on Mary, a book for women on leadership called Lead Like the Real You, and a book on suffering called Where is God in All the Suffering? So maybe they can check out some of those books.
Amen. Well, thank you so much for your leadership in the march that we have toward Christianity and freedom of religion, freedom of thought, because God gave us choices. We should give other people choices, but we should make sure they know what the truth is. So important. So You've been very courageous and an example of how to do that. And we appreciate it very much.
Thank you so much.
Well, we're back, and what a powerful and timely conversation that was with Dr. Orr-Ewing, reminding us that apologetics is not just about winning arguments, but it's about standing confidently in the truth, being a light in the environment where you are. In an age of confusion and compromise, we need leaders who are courageous, kind, intelligent, and humble. And I hope those of you who are parents will make sure that your children listen to this podcast and gain the courage to stand strongly for what they believe in. That's it for this week. Please subscribe for free, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Tell other people about us. We really want to spread common sense. We want to make common sense common again. And remember the cornerstone principles that are so important: faith, liberty, community, and life. We'll see you next week.